Weiner, and these are the Transformational Dialogues. We are now working toward our 6th year of doing these, and I want to thank the people that have been coming back month after month for years, and for those that haven't been here. It's really my pleasure to introduce Suzanne Fageol, who is a friend, a colleague. The breadth of your experience and mastery and knowledge just continues to impress me and touch me. This year at the Dialogues, we're doing the Year of the Inner Journey. So really, what is the deep work of the soul? And so tonight we're going to begin with spiritual direction. And many people don't even know that there's a field of spiritual direction. And Suzanne Fageol, as a trained person in that field, as well as an appreciation as a cranio-sacral and somatic therapist, and in the field of trauma and so many different arenas, it's really with the hat primarily of spiritual director that I invited you here today. So without further ado, let's just give her a round of applause. Okay, so I'm just curious, before we start, how many people out there know that there's a specific field or profession or field, I guess is the best, of spiritual direction? So most, okay. Other than priest, rabbi, cleric, chaplain. So I think it's a really good place to start to just kind of frame what that is for those listeners and viewers that have no idea, and then we're going to talk about you. But okay, just to start.
Okay. Well, it's best known in the West, coming through the monastic tradition of the Middle Ages, and in the West was primarily formed as monks needed someone to talk to as they were living this very contemplative life, and as they went on their spiritual inner journeys, lots of things came up for them, and they were looking for someone who was, as it were, walking alongside of them, but also kind of knew the territory. And so, hence, the profession of spiritual direction was born. Many of the founders of major monastic orders were themselves spiritual directors, specifically Benedict, Ignatius of Loyola, who then founded the Jesuits, and some others that you could name, but it doesn't matter really at the moment. So pretty much until the last century, or the middle 1800s maybe, it was the profession of either ordained Catholic priests or monks or nuns, because finally women came into the picture because they quickly discovered that the men really couldn't help them with. Okay.
Right where you left off.
So, starting in the mid-1800s, lay people began to be interested in doing spiritual direction, and there are several people in the tradition, both male and female, probably the most well-known being a woman by the name of Evelyn Underhill, who wrote a very famous book on mysticism. But it still stayed pretty much within the confines of the Catholic Church, but it was in England that the Anglicans took it up. And so pretty much until about the 1950s, really, it was the domain of that end of the church, and also the Orthodox Church had spiritual directors. And in the 1950s, many of the Protestant denominations became interested in spiritual direction. And now we've gone from interdenominational to interfaith to interspiritual. And the way I would distinguish between interfaith and interspiritual is interfaith is staying in your own base tradition, but engaging with other faith traditions. And interspiritual is for folks who have a more eclectic practice where they pull things from a lot of different traditions or none. And that's a very recent development in spiritual direction. The training has been done mostly by Roman Catholic organizations, again, up until very recently. Now we have Jewish, Sufi, and of course there's been a long-standing tradition in the Asian traditions of having a spiritual guide. And the difference, I think, between maybe East and West is that the Eastern guides are guiding along a very specific path, meditative path or something, you know, a Tibetan lineage of ritual practice and stuff. And so all the direction is very specifically guided into that. Whereas in the West, it's more about the individual's experience of and with the sacred, the divine, God, however someone would name it. Now the main thing I want to say here that is a misnomer, it's a horrible word, spiritual direction. I mean, it just doesn't, it sounds like I'm directing someone else as a spiritual director. I'm not. The idea is that both the person being directed and the director are being guided and directed by the sacred. But unfortunately, nobody's really come up with a better name, because if you talk about the spiritual counselor, that implies that I'm doing something that is much more along the lines of advice, or guide also could suggest that, but you're going to find all kinds of names: spiritual guide, spiritual director, spiritual companion. Soul friend is the translation from the Celtic. Anamkara. You're going to find all different terms in there.
I'm gonna
Yeah.
take a pause.
Okay.
Just have a sip of water if you like.
Okay.
So to bring it to the personal, so that's a big historical piece, and there may be some more delineations, distinctions you want to make. But for those people that are within the congregation, within a faith, I'm curious, and opposed to those people that sit outside of a congregation, how might they find their way into a spiritual director? A spiritual director is found still within the faith, so people, how do they know whether to go to a chaplain or a spiritual director? Those people that are outside of a congregation, how would they find that?
Right.
So give me a little bit of the lay of the land that way.
Okay. Most people in parishes or churches or congregations have no idea what a spiritual director is. Most people find their way to a spiritual director, do so either because they know they have a friend or an acquaintance that works with a spiritual director, or they've gone to something like this where they've heard about it. It doesn't happen mostly within congregational frameworks in either the Judeo or the Christian tradition. And it's primarily, I think, because the congregation is more interested in promoting the faith and the dogma of the faith, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but they're more interested in the corporate worship of the community and faith development within a particular tradition. Spiritual direction focuses on direct personal experience with the divine, and that may or may not be from within inside a faith tradition, but it's not the same thing as being having faith formation in a particular tradition, like what did John Wesley say about sin, or what did Pope Benedict say about whatever. Okay, whereas spiritual direction has much more to do with what comes out of the individual's direct relationship with the divine in their prayer or meditation time. So one can assume that people come to spiritual direction because they have an ongoing, pretty serious spiritual practice, a consistent spiritual practice. And somehow the folks that come to that find their way to a spiritual director just by virtue of the fact of where they would hang out. They would go on retreats. You would find spiritual directors more in retreat centers.
I'm going to make it personal then. So how do people, in a community, a small community like this, do you say that's appropriate for what you've seen find you? People that are on an active spiritual path that somehow had some reason for seeking something further than...
Yes, they've either seen me in the context of the church, because I also happen to be an Episcopal priest, or most of my own clients have come from teaching and people who've become interested through that, taken some kind of program on spirituality, where it's been mentioned or something, and so they've come in through that, they've gone, oh, that sounds really interesting, I'd like to try that, and so they've come in that way. So that's how I've mostly gotten my client base.
Is it mostly, would you say, to deepen, to take something further, or they're hitting some obstacle, or is it split, or is
People come for different reasons. Some people come because they want to start a spiritual practice, and they've been really wanting to deepen a spiritual practice, but feel like they would like some support and some guideposts around that. And so a lot of people come in because they want to know about starting a spiritual practice and what that would look like and what that would look like for them, and so that's their entry point. Other people come because they've had some kind of crisis in their life, spiritual or otherwise, and are coming looking to have conversation about it. And there's an overlap there with a pastor or a chaplain, but the chaplain or the minister, usually it's a more short-term thing. They may meet with them once or twice, but those folks don't really have the time to sit with someone long-term. I mean, some people do a small part of that, but if you're running a congregation, you've got a lot on your plate, you really don't have time to see a lot of spiritual direction clients. Other people come because they have a deep practice and they want an ongoing companion to listen and reflect with. So the primary, I would say the primary thing a spiritual director does is listen. Listen very deeply. But we are also trained to look at a lot of, I don't want to say issues exactly, but some of them are issues and some of them are movements of the spirit. And it doesn't really matter what tradition you're looking at. So for instance, you may hit a wall where you find your practice really boring, and it's like, what do you do when that happens? Or you may have a very profound experience and not know how to deal with it. Or you may find that you're in a lot of resistance and you don't know how to work through it, for instance. And it's in a training program as a spiritual director, these are some of the things that you learn how to work with clients that come to you.
Okay. Give me a little bit of background how one's both an Episcopal priest, priest or priestess?
Priest. I mean, well, in their tradition, tradition, that's what they would call it, yeah.
And as a spiritual director, spiritual counselor, what order did those come in? And why?
Actually, I was a spiritual director before I became a priest. And the two were not, the two really had nothing to do with each other.
Okay, you're really going to have to explain that.
Well, I don't see them in the same arena at all.
Okay, and you're going to have to explain that.
And so,
could you at some point talk about what your training was?
Sure.
Thanks.
Yeah, I will. I always knew I wanted to be a priest. I fell into being a spiritual director. And what I mean by that is it's usually a calling. It's not something that you sort of decide you're going to go do. Usually you fall into it. And for me it was like, I don't know, from the time I was in junior high, people were always coming and saying, can I talk to you for a minute? And I didn't even know that it was a profession at that point, okay? It wasn't until I was in college that I met and started working with a spiritual director myself. And it was just like everywhere I turned, people would say, you're a spiritual director. And so, I don't know, at some point in graduate school, I guess I just kind of started actually doing it. And then I went for my formal training. But that whole time I was studying theology and everything else I was going to do to become a priest. But the two, to me, were very separate.
So you were in school getting to answer the question, going undergraduate.
Right, but that doesn't have anything to do with spiritual direction training.
I get that. But
In
that's
fact,
just a chronology.
right.
So we have the theological degree.
Right.
Then the spiritual direction was a program outside of that.
Completely.
And then you continued with your divinity program to become a priest in Episcopal Church. Okay.
Right. Although, as priests, we were all required to have a spiritual director while we were going through seminary, which is not a requirement from a lot of different traditions, but it is in the Catholic and the Episcopal Anglican traditions. I can't really, and I don't know, I think some of the Jewish seminaries now require it as well. I mean, it makes sense because you hit a lot of very interesting spiritual issues when you're studying for a theological degree, actually. So I finally did my formal training 10 years after I was ordained. Mostly because I thought, well, it probably would be good to have some kind of formal training. You know, just to be able to say I was, you know, had the diploma or whatever. And so that's when I did the formal training. Now, I trained with the Jesuits, which is probably one of the most rigorous programs that's out there, and it was a 3-year program. A lot of, and one of the things that I was trained to do as I did that was to lead 8 and 30-day silent retreats for people. And believe me, a lot of stuff comes up when you're on an 8 or 30-day silent retreat. And of course, we were required to do that as part of the training every year, both an 8-day and a 30-day. So it was quite a rigorous training. And but now programs are kind of all over the map. Some of them are 2 years, some of them are 1 year. It's just different. It's all over the place now in terms of what people are doing, and part of that is market driven in the sense that people don't have the time to do the kind of training that I did. I mean, you have to be pretty serious about wanting to do it to put that much energy and time into it, you know. And what that has gained for me is the ability to teach spiritual directors and to supervise spiritual directors. So I come in at like 3 different levels. I both am a spiritual director, I supervise, and I teach. So
So I haven't seen it like on the top 20 careers list.
No.
So. But despite that, is it something that's waxing, waning, growing?
No, it's
as
growing.
A career, is it growing?
It's growing. There is an organization called Spiritual Directors International, and they started out when they started in like 1979 with maybe 300 members, and now there's over 6,000 worldwide. So it's definitely growing.
Do you charge?
Yes. Now that's another interesting area for, because at some point, at one point it was sort of part of one's spiritual service, if you will. And certainly the brothers and the religious sisters that did it as part of what they did as their vocation, and likewise priests. But once secular people began to do it, some do it as an avocation and some do it as a vocation. I do it as a vocation, which means with all the training and stuff I've had, I earn a living doing this. And so I charge, and I charge I charge top dollar for that. But I figured with 30 years of experience, I can do that. But you will find it all over the map, from free to $20 an hour to $150 an hour. And most people come in somewhere between 50 and 100. And the other thing about it is you only meet once a month, because you want to give time to take that back into your spiritual practice and to integrate what you're learning, and to allow for some time for things to happen interiorly before you come back to have another conversation. And it's also seen as a long-term thing. I mean, most of the people I work with, I've been working with for 15, 20 years. And it is actually, when you go through that, you have an opportunity to see your whole spiritual journey over a longer period of time, in years, that you begin to pick up some of the more subtle patterns of what may be going on at a deeper level. And so obviously, in that sense, it's a benefit to keep the same spiritual director for a while. And sometimes it's good to change it up. I mean, it just sort of depends on where you're at and as a client, you know.
Interesting. So, in a way of working, and of course it varies, are there some things that are standard? In other words, there's a period of listening, there's a period of sharing, there's, for lack of a better word, homework or agreed upon things to do in between, just to establish a little bit of the structure.
Right. Okay, the answer is there isn't any. Every client is different, okay? Personally, I ask everybody to write a spiritual autobiography when they start with me, which gives a kind of base touchstone. And I give them like 4 or 5 different formats that they can work with. I encourage creativity if they want to do it as an art project. I don't care so long as they can look at what they've done and remember what they're talking about. So I ask for that, and that can be really helpful because you can begin to see things that may have developed even in your childhood that are suddenly emerging again later on. Maybe it looks slightly different, but it's like, oh, especially when people are trying to discern what is my mission in life or whatever, because that's another big thing for spiritual direction. It's like, what's my service in the world, you know? And that's an ongoing question, because you may come back later in your life and say, I think it's shifting, but I really don't know what it is, so I want to explore that. So that's another thing to do. So anyway, I would do that. I would encourage journal writing, just because no matter how vivid your experiences may be, 3 months from down the line, you may not remember at all what happened. And so, but if you have some kind of record of it, you can go back and say, oh yeah, I see that, you know. So like for instance, I mean, this is just totally made up, but like, you might have 3 or 4 significant dreams about refugees. You may have a year or 2 that goes by, and you may find yourself drawn to books about refugees, or movies about refugees, or you find yourself reading newspapers about refugees. But this theme keeps coming back, and suddenly you're here and you're going, I don't know, I'm retired now, I don't know what I want to do with my life. They retired at 55, say, and all of a sudden what they realize is they want to work with refugees. And so, and as they look back, they can see that this has actually been a recurrent theme. And then you explore the whole spiritual thing about, well, what does it mean to be a refugee spiritually? Do you think of yourself as a refugee spiritually? What does it mean to take refuge? And what's the difference between being a refugee? So you get the idea. So there's a whole exploration there that can open up in terms of what is this all about? And what am I being called to? And then there's the whole thing about being falsely called, in the sense of coming back from a retreat. And I mean, the most classic thing is, I'm going to Africa to work in the missions or whatever. I mean, that was an older one, you know. And so you pack up your bags and you get over there and you go, oh my God, what have I done? You know, you have this, idealized view of what you're going over there to do, and you find yourself in a very different situation. And to have someone to go put the brakes on and kind of go, okay, let's really explore what this would mean. And if it's still there, it will consistently be there, like the whole thing with the refugees. And then you have to decide, well, am I going to work with refugees in Seattle? Am I going overseas? Am I going to work with an agency? Am I going to work with some kind of spiritual agency? You get the point, there's a lot to explore there and to unpack. So what seems like something quite simple is actually can expand into a couple of years worth of work.
When, I know everything is specific, so I don't mean to generalize, but when do you tend to see people often seeking spiritual direction? Is it do you see it more often during times of community challenges, things are happening in the world that are intense and driving people to look for deeper meaning? Do you see it when people face a diagnosis? So I'm just wondering, when people come in, what are some of the reasons, other than seeking to deepen their spiritual path, that you might see people for, and how do you assist in that process?
Definitely an illness. Definitely when something in their life is not, they're realizing they're not in control. It could be an illness, it could be loss of a job, you know, it could be a divorce, anything like that. So it could be that, or it could be simply that something, they've had an experience. They've either, a lot of people go on like a Vipassana retreat or some kind of a Buddhist meditation retreat and have some kind of an experience. They don't necessarily want to become a Buddhist in a particular tradition, but they're realizing, oh, there's a lot going on here, and I really would like somebody to sit with and listen to me and to help, you know, look at what does it mean when I'm so restless in meditation, or, you know, why did I have this really deep experience and now I can't have it again? And so, you know, there's spiritual issues like that that can come up that would bring somebody into direction.
What's the difference between, you started off with the distinction being a deep listening.
Yeah.
So where is that boundary between being a presence in a space or listening, and, for lack of a better word, counseling?
Okay.
Speak about that duality.
If they hammer anything into everybody at spiritual direction school, it's like, shut up and listen. So the idea is that the main thing you are doing is very deep listening. And in a long-term program, you'll spend the whole first year working on listening skills and how to deepen those listening skills. Now, some models are much more directive and people do give advice, but it's not the norm. The norm is you shut up and you listen. And then the second, I would say the second skill that comes in that is probably the most useful and least directive is how to ask questions. How to ask questions of the directee that lead them deeper into whatever it is they're trying to grapple with their experience. So there's a whole art to asking questions, and that too is another piece, big component of spiritual direction training.
So I'm going to ask, I didn't expect to go here, but the idea of spending a year learning how to listen and a length of period of time about asking questions, could you shed a little light on what that looks like? Because I'm curious. I only have like an imagination of what a year of learning how to listen would be like.
Okay.
So could you just give us some sense of what that kind of training is about?
So the first thing is you're asked to write a verbatim about what you talked about in the spiritual direction session. And you're like, what did I talk about? Or what did they talk about? So the first thing is sort of learning how to cue into remembering things in the spiritual direction session. And some people take notes, but most people don't take notes. So it means that you either have to take notes after the person leaves, or you have to remember the thread, okay? And the point is that that's one piece. The second is to listen for the subtle cues. Because it might be a real throwaway comment that you want to pick up on and remember, either to bring back that time or another time. And it may be that you will know that this is going to be a big issue for that person because of your training, but they won't see it, and you know it's not the right time to bring it up. So you have to know when to hold it and when to fold it, as it were. And that requires deep knowing, really listening, being able to listen deeply. You're listening both for what's going on here, as well as what's going on with the other person. So you have to cultivate the ability to listen to both yourself and the other person. at the same time, because if you start to feel something, you need to know, is this mine or is it theirs? And so a lot of it is trying to figure that out and learning what the difference is when you're going to get triggered by something that somebody else says because it's your issue too, or whether you're really feeling uncomfortable because they're feeling really uncomfortable. And so you're listening for the nuance in the felt sense. So you're listening with all your faculties, not just your ears. You're watching for subtle cues. No, I'm fine. Okay, or not so subtle cues. Okay, sure, I'm going to talk about this. So so listening is a multi-sensory learning.
That's great.
Okay.
Perfect. Thank you. It's great, actually. We're working on a project together and teaching stress and trauma together, and we were just the other day speaking about listening.
We're teaching about how to work with stress and trauma. We're not
Yes,
teaching
thank
stress.
you. Speaking is a multi-sensory environment. But that it's funny because we kind of whisked over, all right, we're going to do a section on listening, being present, healthcare providers, how to listen more deeply, etc. But that really expands that even deeper than I thought, so thank you for that. That's great.
Yeah.
The second part was the listening skills, and help me, the second...
Questions.
The questions, right. So invite us a little bit into the world of learning how to question.
Okay. So I can say, you could ask me something and I can say, so was that good? And you'll say, yeah. End of conversation, right? I mean, I'm being very simplistic here, but, or I could say, something like, that sounds like it was very important to you. Would you be interested in elaborating a little bit more about that experience? And then you get deeper into it, and you might say somebody came back from a retreat, and they had an experience of oneness, where they actually felt their body dissolve and that they were one with the universe, okay? So it's called a unitive experience. So they come back and they report that they have a unitive experience. You take one look at them walking in the door, and you can tell they're not back yet. They're like, woo. I mean, they're completely dissociated. In a good way, they're very happy, but they're definitely not present, okay? So part of helping them get back here is through asking questions. But they're not going to be in a left brain space, so you have to ask right brain questions, okay? So you might say, tell me what it is that you're experiencing right now in your body. And that'll bring them up for a minute, because they won't be feeling their body because they're not in it, right? Okay, so they'll be like, okay, and so so they might say something like, well, I feel like I'm floating, okay, and I'd be like, and where do you notice in your body that you're floating? Well, I guess my head, okay. And what are you noticing about the rest of your body? Oh, well, not very much, actually. Okay, but now that you asked me that question, I guess I can really I can feel my heart, so, et cetera, et cetera. So you unpack, it helps to unpack the experience. And then finally what you come to is, I don't want to feel what's going on in my body because I'm afraid I'll lose that wonderful, joyful experience. And then you have a little discussion about how functional would you be if you walked around in that state all the time. Okay? So you see again how one little thing turns into a multi-session issue, as people begin to try to figure out how to incorporate their spiritual life into their everyday life. And that's another thing that a lot of people, I get a lot of discussions about, well, that's my spiritual life and this is this life, and how do I bring the two together? And that's a very rich field of inquiry. And it's going to be different for each person. And that has to do with another thing that we would be learning in this training is different spiritual types. Not everybody has a proclivity for relating to the divine in a particular way. And so, I mean, there are different categorizations of them, but one sort of really easy one to work with is there are those who are devotional and for whom the heart is on lead. And their practices and the way they experience the divine will be heart-centered. There are other people who come through the intellect and for whom reading is what inspires them and leads them into a knowing of the divine. There are others who are contemplative, who would just love to spend the entire day sitting in silence, not thinking about anything. Now, those are relatively rare, but they do exist. And then the fourth one would be the action. Service. And it is through the doing of the service that they come more closely into connection with the divine. So, I mean, there's many more, subtleties around that. But, so I get somebody who walks in and goes, I've been trying to meditate for 6 months and I just can't do it. And I'm like, well, tell me a little bit about, what do you consider your spirit, when you talk about yourself being in connection with the divine, what does that look like? Oh, well, I work at the homeless shelter. Yeah. And it's like, bingo, hello, you're not, you got to design, we have to figure out a way for you to have a practice here that's much more oriented towards your spiritual type.
The connection with the divine.
Right, as opposed to what you think it's
sit down on a chair, don't move,
right.
That'll connect you.
Stop thinking.
Right. And of course, that's the other thing. People think, I'm going to start a spiritual practice. It's like, I'm going to meditate for an hour in the morning. And 2 weeks it goes great, and then it just completely falls apart. So it's about tailoring the spiritual direction for where you are. I have one client who's a doctor with 4 kids, under 10. Okay? And she's a contemplative. It's been real interesting helping her to fine-tune how she can get fed spiritually with that kind of a schedule. So, those are the kinds of things that come. And also anything in your life is fair game. So I was, kind of joking earlier, but I'm not. Sexuality can be a big issue, especially since a lot of people come to the spiritual through the sexual. So, it's about allowing, trusting and building a trust that that anybody feels that they can bring any area of their life into spiritual direction for question. And for inquiry is what I like to say. And to work with that and what that might be like.
I have a question about the training, some more.
Yeah.
Now, you had already done a theological degree, so if you had not done that,
Right.
And you talked about the year with the listening and the questioning, so the interpersonal kinds of things, what about the theory? So what kind of theory did you do in your 3-year?
Well, I mean, there was a course on the history of spiritual direction, and so we talked about the Desert Fathers and the, all that sort of, the brief of which I gave you at the beginning. But we don't really get into theology, because see, the thing is, it's not about what you know. It's about what they're bringing to you. So I have everything from a Southern Baptist to a Buddhist in my practice, and I have to work with their theology, not mine. So partly what that means for me is that I have to be able to I have to know what I'm comfortable with and what I'm not comfortable with, and to refer if I'm not comfortable with their tradition. But I'm working from where they are, not from necessarily where I am. So I have clients that I don't share a theology with, but I can honor their journey in their own theology. And that's the point, is to work with them in their theology. So if I'm not particularly familiar with a piece of their theology, I would ask them to tell me about it, or their understanding of it. Then sometimes they'll bring me a scripture or something and say, well, this is it, and I'm trying to figure out how to interpret it, okay? Um, and then, you know, I work with them on what their understanding is, and the advice I might give them, it would be something like, perhaps it would be helpful to you to find a couple of people that have talked about this particular precept in your tradition, and maybe look at those and then come back and we'll talk about them. So that's about as much advice as I would give, is maybe lead them to resources. And then the other piece of that you asked me is, because I was Ignatian trained, we worked with Ignatius of Loyola's Spiritual Exercises, which is a manual the first manual ever written for spiritual directors. And it's written in 16th century Spanish Catholicism, and it's like, I mean, if you were to read it, you'd be like, oh my God, I can't deal with this, you know. So you have to learn to translate it, okay? But in it is the entire, Ignatius deals with all the different movements of spirit, how to tell a false one from a real one. He talks about the terms of consolation and desolation, and how consolation can sometimes look like tears. You know, you can know you're doing the right thing, but it's still a hard thing to do. And how you would distinguish between the two, but all of these are universals. Everybody in any tradition encounters these kinds of you know, actions, patterns, whatever, as they go through their spiritual journey at one time or another, or many times over. So, yeah.
What do you find is the hardest for people to get past when they're hitting something with their spiritual path and they hit a wall? What wall?
Patience.
Yeah.
Being patient.
Yeah.
Everybody wants to fix it now. And sometimes one has to wait on spirit for a long time, years sometimes, years. And to find a way to know you are connected and yet wait, patiently wait for the right timing. And that takes a lot of perseverance. Because, you know, and many spiritual masters talk about dry periods that can last for years sometimes. And there's some sense that you're not completely disconnected from spirit, but you're not getting any answers. It's like talking to a wall. On faith and hope that something very deep is at work, and that at some point it will be revealed.
What about people trying to make sense out of their relationship with spirit with great loss? Loss of a child,
Yeah,
those.
It depends on the person, because some people can be in great grief but feel the spirit is very close with them. Other people feel that that spirit has abandoned, or God has abandoned them. I'm trying to use different terms, but you gotta use whatever fits for you. And so people deal with the loss then very differently. It depends on, you know, whether they're struggling with how to handle the grief, or they're struggling with the fact that on top of the grief, they're also dealing with the fact that they don't feel like there's any spiritual connection. And again, it's a matter of looking for the minute signs that there's still a presence. And they can be pretty minute and take very subtle listening to discern it. Because the biggest obstacle that you encounter in the spiritual journey is no movement at all. But very often, subtle movement can look like no movement. And this is again where having a director can be really helpful to point out, ooh, there's a little movement, ooh, there's a little movement. Whereas you might, in your grief or whatever, see nothing. So like if somebody's struggling with loss, for instance, and feels like spirit is not with them, it's like, okay, so who have you been with in these last few days? What happens? Where's the gratitude? And gratitude is usually the way back in. but you don't, if you're in this lens of grief, it's very hard to actually stop and notice that a flower is actually a place of gratitude and connection, for instance, or somebody's smile. Especially in grief, because what you tend to remember is all the stupid comments everybody makes, you know, and how you just want to get them out of your life because you don't want to have to explain or blah, blah, blah. But there's always somebody or something that becomes a resource, that becomes a place of gratitude. And sometimes it's just hanging on by your fingernails with those pieces that gets you through what feels like a completely dry period. But this is where it's really helpful to have somebody that you're walking with in the journey who can point that out to you.
We were talking a lot about resources the other day. This would be a place for helping somebody going through that kind of desert of cultivating, appreciating, realizing what are the resources that maybe they take for granted or they don't even see anymore somehow, to build that back up.
Right, and sometimes the resource is just literally sitting with a person and saying, yeah, it stinks. and that's exactly where we are. It stinks. It's not fair. You know, there's no pushing. Okay, there's an invitation to notice where there might be moments of gratitude, but sometimes, right now, you just have to sit, and it's that person knowing that somebody is sitting with you in that space that is the resource. They may not see it at the time, but at some point they will be like, oh my God, I never could have gotten through that if we hadn't been sitting together. And you're not doing anything other than going, yeah, you're right, this stinks.
I'd like to start opening it up to some questions if you have, or anybody. Otherwise we'll keep going, but I just want to make sure I open it up if you do.
I have a question about, I've lived here on the island about almost 4 years now, and it is a very spiritual place, and there's a large part of the community that talks a great deal about their spiritual life. And I teach meditation, and I find that people come with, because it's a place where we share so much of our spiritual life, that people have great expectations of what their, almost like a comparison thing going on about what their spiritual life ought to be because of what someone else's spiritual life is. And I just was curious how that, I would imagine it comes up in spiritual direction.
Oh yeah, lots of times. Yeah, they're doing their own self-comparisons. Or the other thing is, that can happen is, you're sitting there as the director and somebody comes in and is having all these amazing spiritual experiences, and you're sitting there going, shoot.
You know what?
you know.
That happens to me with meditation, like, wow, I wish I had some way you had me.
Right, exactly.
But they're training for the spiritual Olympics. So.
Right. So, but yes, it is. But it is very often a self-judgment. You know, I'm not doing this enough.
Right,
I'm not doing it well enough. If I did, I would be having all of these. That's the other thing. I mean, there's this expectation that you're supposed to be on some kind of high all the time if you're connected to spirit, and it doesn't work like that. At least not for most of us.
To whatever degree you're willing to share, where have been your stumbling blocks, or one that you might speak of, and how you work through it, so we can bring it home to ourselves as well. Maybe. Okay. I mean, your wall's not going to be my wall necessarily,
right.
But still.
No, it's definitely not. No, what comes to my mind is probably one of those dry periods that I would speak about is the time when I was trying to get ordained, which was the time when the American Episcopal Church didn't ordain women as priests. And so I went through that whole period right up to the time that they did, where there were a lot of obstacles and a lot of people that didn't want to see women be ordained, and a lot of comments from people. And so in my own personal spiritual life, that was a big, 8 years of, sitting with that. And then again, not so much for me, but then I happened to be in a position that I was living in Britain when the whole issue was on the table in England. And watching women go through the same thing that I had gone through in terms of, well, maybe women shouldn't be priests. I mean, you know, there was the doubting thing, there was the sense of feeling abandoned, like if I'm supposed to be a priest, why isn't this easy? You know, why is this so bloody difficult to make this happen? And feeling at times like I was pushing, and was I pushing when it really wasn't what it was meant to be? And how do I know whether I'm just pushing or whether it still really is what I'm being called to? And my spiritual director kept referring me back again, and this is where the long view can be really helpful. Well, you know, this happened to you at this age, this happened to you at this age. Do you still doubt that with this kind of history, you're not called? You know, so that's where the long view can be really helpful in terms of bolstering you up in a time that feels like it's a really fallow period, and you're wondering why am I doing this? Am I barking up the wrong tree?
What brings you the greatest joy in this work?
Oh, the privilege of sitting and listening to people's spiritual journeys, it never gets old. I mean, even the same person, because they're not the same person when you meet them every month. And just I just feel like the luckiest person in the world that I get to listen to people's spiritual journeys. You know, it never, ever feels dull or boring, ever.
I don't know where to go from that comment. I think we'll just sit in silence for a moment and see what comes. What I asked you before, what would be your greatest vision from tonight's gathering? Like, there's a group of people, we're having sort of a discussion, whatever you want to call this forum, but the topic of going inward, the topic of grappling with one's relationship with God, with Spirit, the support system that you help to provide and are sharing about that, but what would be your greatest vision for the ripples to come out of this evening to be?
Okay. Well, I mean, the times we're living in are not easy. And it seems to me that, from my biased perspective, being in touch with your spiritual self is one of the best resources you have for coping with these times. And so I guess whatever you take away, but I would hope that it would foster a desire to cultivate that aspect of your being, with greater acuity and dedication. And if part of that is having a conversation with someone on an ongoing basis, then so be it. You know, I just think that there's a lot more room. I mean, I think that a lot more people would be, in these times, would be helped if they had a spiritual companion, however that is. Because, I mean, there's lots of different models. There's peer spiritual direction, there's group spiritual direction, there's individual spiritual direction.
Is there spiritual coaching?
So, well, there are some people that would say that, but again, it's sort of like, well, what is it?
Right.
Because to me, coaching is much more goal-oriented.
Right.
And action-oriented, and sometimes that's called for in here, and sometimes there are coaching skills, because I'm also a coach. So there are sometimes coaching skills that can come in really handy in spiritual direction. But it's more to me, that coaching, that skill package, that coaching skill package is about gaining clarity on an issue. I forget what the question was. I got sidetracked. Oh yes, right. Yes, okay. Yeah. So in some form or another, to engage in talking about and being with, in a deeper way, your own spiritual journey.
we just, I was sitting back and just reflecting how many other priests slash coaches slash spiritual directors slash body workers I know. And I say that with a laugh, but on the other hand, it's incredible. I mean, I know of nobody else that has that breadth to go from a very body, somatic-oriented experience of, and I know that what you bring is a spiritual approach to a body-centered work. And from all the way over to being an Episcopal priest, it's just an incredible depth and breadth, an array of skills and experience to bring to somebody that's struggling, seeking, etc. So I just need to reiterate how much respect I have for that you bring, so thank you.
Thanks. And I'll just take a moment here to say that in one of the pieces that's increasingly coming into being in the field of spiritual direction is body work. In terms of Reiki or healing touch, but people actually physically working bodily with their directees. Takomi, I mean, you know. Yeah.
I'd like to know if you have any experience or what you think of this. And this is interesting because I was at coffee with some women this morning and I said, I feel like I need to bust through something spiritually, that I'm at a place where that needs to happen. And though I'm not someone who takes drugs, I'm wondering about an whatever it's called, ayahuasca, or one of these, or peyote or something,
Right.
to move through to something else. Just curious about your own experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a very legitimate way to work with it if that's how you feel. I guess that what I'm trying to say is if you feel like it would be beneficial, you wouldn't be the first person. And there are many traditions, Native American and otherwise, and the whole South American shamanic tradition that regularly use psychedelics as a way of gaining wisdom. And then they spend time working with what came out of the experience. So, and you're the only person that can say whether or not that's a right choice for you, but it's certainly a very legitimate and, pretty often used choice. If you were my directee, we would be looking very carefully at how do you feel about this? Are you in a safe environment when you're doing it? Do you feel like you would be held? Do you have a safety net? I would certainly want to explore all of that. But I wouldn't say, oh my God, you can't do that. That's, no. I wouldn't ever tell anybody not to do anything unless I knew it would be harmful to them or someone else.
Great question, thank you.
Do you have a sense of how many of the traditional theological training schools are onto this? I mean,
None.
it seemed to me that
Or very few,
I lived a block from the Divinity School in Princeton.
Yeah.
I knew a lot of the people going through it, and they were reading texts,
Right.
and they get to the end and say, "Okay, you're a man of God."
Right.
I was like, "No, you're not. You're a guy who read a lot of texts."
Right.
But if they had spiritual directors, they
Right.
might actually be men of God when they
Right.
went through.
Yeah. The seminary that I went to required it.
Yeah, but others don't.
But it's not a requirement in most seminaries, which it seems absolutely. I think it is in Catholic
I
seminaries.
think it might be too. I think it's quite.
I think
It's definitely it's a much stronger base
Right.
there in
Right. It might not be on a
Catholicism, yeah.
monthly basis, but you
Yeah.
have to have met some point with the spiritual director, or at least go on retreat where you would have spiritual direction on the retreat. But no, it's not, and because this is the thing that's so crazy about it. My divinity training was, you're absolutely right, was completely left brain head stuff. with one exception of 3 months of clinical pastoral
I
education.
mean, it's similar to medical education, the same sort of
Yeah.
lack is there, and so you can choose whether to change their training or just develop this whole other thing, which is,
Right.
just,
That's actually a fascinating analogy to look at that as a type of, well, we'll fix your soul. I mean, in a medical allopathic kind of sense of there's a symptom here, let me give you information, let me tell you how to do it, this is what you should do. Yeah, it's an interesting analogy,
I mean, all you do in seminary is you learn how to preach and you learn how to run a parish. You know, and if you're lucky, you're pastoral by nature, and so that kind of, you know, care and stuff just comes naturally to you, so you gravitate towards doing it. Just like some people have a natural, I mean, they're just natural spiritual directors. You know, there's people come to them because they're wise in that way.
How much of the challenge of our time is related to the fact that we've got this dichotomy? The education, which is the pinnacle of what the goal of what we're going for in our culture, teaches from the head up through the mind, the brain, and leaves the heart and the body. And we wonder why we're all a mess.
Right, and to me, I mean, if I had a personal mission left in this field, it would be to re-embody spirituality in the field of spiritual direction. Because we have 2,000 years of Western theology that has completely divorced the soul, the spirit, whatever, from the body. And what we're learning through neuroscience is you can't do that. And so I would see as one of my personal missions to re-embody, you know, the spirit and the body, and that's you know, it's an interesting uphill battle.
You just gave a lecture recently, I happen to know, on the neuroscience of spirituality.
Spiritual practice.
Spiritual practice. I know we're winding down in time, but that's such a passion of mine. What might be in that re-embodiment idea, what you just spoke of, what might be a helpful takeaway that might support people in understanding something about the way that they think the brain works with regard to supporting their spiritual practice?
Okay.
I don't mean to put you on the spot.
No,
but
don't, not at all, Craig. The one thing we all have in common in relating to the spiritual realm is that we have to be present in order to experience it. We have to be present in ourselves in order to have a relationship with anybody, a deep, authentic relationship, which means we have to be centered in our bodies. And the more mindful we are about being present, the deeper the experience will be. And so what we've learned from neuroscience is that the way to get present is to follow the sensations in the body. So again, I come back to that thing about somebody comes back from a spiritual retreat and they're like, oh, I had the most incredible experience, and I'm like, and where do you feel that in your body? Oh, my heart. Well, tell me about what's in your heart. Well, I feel joy. How do you know that that's joy in your heart? Well, there's this radiating warmth. If you focus on that, and you continue to focus more deeply on feeling this sensation of that warmth in your heart, it's almost like it's like taking a map of the territory. Okay, and the more closely you fix the point, the coordinates of the point, which is to pay attention to that particular experience. If you really take the time to deeply feel it, and just sit with it in curiosity and let it unfold and see what it does, I can guarantee you that the next time you need a resource, and I say to you, heart experience, you can drop right back into it. You can practice dropping back into it. And then you will always have that as a touchstone in rough times. How's that?
I think we'll officially end with that.